Cites a midrash in Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs. Shlomo says, "Hagido li shova nafshi." Tell me, the one who loves me. Eichot tireh, eichot tarbitz b'tzoroyim. See, cites Rashi. We know that Shir Hashirim is really, it's an allegory. It's a love, the most intense level of love between two individuals, a husband and wife, but it's only an allegory for the relationship between the Jewish people and Hashem. So Rashi explains, we as the Jewish people say to God, as a woman says to her husband, explain to me, how exactly do you express your love to me? How do you shepherd your sheep? And how do you put them in a restful situation at midday in the exile among the nations of the world? Despite the fact we're in exile among the nations of the world, how do you really maintain us and protect us? He says, when the sun shines overhead, that's the most difficult time for flocks. Because if the flocks can't find shade, they're exposed to the sun. There's no respite from the sun. So tzorayim means midday. When we're in Golus, we're in exile, we're like the sun is beating on us. What do we do to find some level of protection despite us being in this setting? And Hashem responds to us. He says, what does this mean? He said, don't you realize you're the most beautiful, special nation among all the nations? How are you able to graze and be saved from the hands of all the oppressors, meaning from our enemies? To be among them, and your youth should not be lost. Of what? The smaller sheep which walk among the legs of the males and female adult sheep. His boni b'darki avosecha rishonim. You should reflect of the ways of your forefathers. Shekibul torosi, sheshamru mitshmarti mitzvosai. They observed my dictates, and my mitzvos, ulchi b'darkeim. That's how you protected from the beating the ones who want to devour you. Not only will you be protected, you'll be valued and revered by the ministers of the world. We find throughout history, we speak about the golden age of Spain. The Jews had a golden age there. This is before the Inquisition, for an extended period of time, where even the greatest Torah sages were ministers in the court of the Spanish Empire. Abarbanel, who was right before the Inquisition, or at the time of the Inquisition. He was the Secretary of Treasury. He was the Finance Minister. He was the Secretary of State. He was the Secretary of Defense. He was everything, Abarbanel. There were many others. Shmuel HaNogid, who was already in time of the Rishonim, earlier times. He himself was way up in the government. If the Jews themselves adhere and they raise their children with a proper understanding, observance that they should continue, and the tradition should be guaranteed, the negative, positive commandments, you'll be valued and revered even by what? Even by the ministers of the world. Yirmiyahu is the one who authored Eicha. Eicha is the elegy at the time of destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and this is what we read on Tisha B'Av. How we mourn the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Here we were royalty, and then we were reduced to slaves. And he said, when we were going into exile, and this is the Al Noras Bavel, which David Melch referred to on the rivers of Babylon, Sham Yoshavnu, Gambochinu, we sat there, we grieved and we cried. Hatzibel Chotzionim, when you go into exile, Shisi Libech L'Mesilo, you have to establish signposts. You have to identify yourselves for who you are. What was the answer? What exactly is Hashem telling the Jews? We're going into exile. We have these people, we're the sheep among 70 wolves. They want to devour us, literally devour us. I mean, what was God telling us? Something we didn't know. That we have to follow the ways of our forefathers. I mean, the only reason why we're going to exile is because we failed. So if we understand the reason why we went to exile is only because we failed, so it's understood. The only chance we have in exile to survive is by correcting the area which we failed. The Chafetz Chaim cites a Yerushalmi Jerusalem Talmud that says that every generation that the temple is not rebuilt, it's like it was destroyed. Why? Because the only reason why it was destroyed was because of unwarranted hate. If we would correct that failing, it would be rebuilt. It would be rebuilt. And it's within our ability to correct it. So when we don't correct it, why don't we have a Beis Hamikdash? We don't have the temple only because we didn't make the correction. So who's held accountable for all the Chil Hashem, for all God's name being desecrated, and the suffering that we have in exile? It's ourselves. A person has a bear trap, and there's a warning sign. Don't go near the bear trap, because if you get caught in that trap, you're going to lose a limb, and you may lose your life. And the person's not careful enough. So who's responsible? The one who set the bear trap. The bear trap was set for what? For bears, not for human beings. It's you because you acted irresponsibly. So if we understand the reason why we went to exile is because we failed, so now we're in exile, of course we have to make the correction. So what is Hashem telling us? That we have to observe the mitzvos. It's understood. So the Chafetz Chaim answers, it's something, what Hashem is telling us is something profound. Profound. It's not so simple. We had mentioned the other day, to be an observant Jew and to advance, the environment has to be conducive. It has to be conducive for that. So here we're in an environment, we're in exile, we're devoid, stripped of all the trappings of what encourages and which gives us a level of sense of who we are and what we should be. It's not there. So in exile, what do? When a person is in the middle of the ocean and he has no swimming device, and even if you have the swimming device, when you're in ocean, a swimming device is not enough. You need more than that. So what do we do when we have these turbulent waters and overwhelming, and we're hit by 100-foot waves every moment? How do you deal with that? That's what the Jewish people are asking God. Of course we have to make corrections, but it seems to be we're in a position where everything's so overwhelming and so contrary and going in the opposite direction. You can't swim upstream. Could you swim up a falls? You can't swim up the falls. The torrents of the water, the force of that water is coming down with such force, you can't go up that falls. In exile, we're literally trying to swim up the falls. How do you do it? That's the question which the Jewish people are asking Hashem. What do we do? V'gam muchpolim b'tzoros merubos. The Mesilas Yesharim, Rabbi Lutzata writes in the Path of the Just that the greatest pitfall that we have, the issue we have to contend with, is distraction. You have to be focused to be able to make corrections, and even though intellectually we understand something, but without focus, you're not going to make those changes. There's so many what we call distractions, overwhelming and legitimate distractions, earning a livelihood, contending with the anti-Semitism. There's so much to contend with. How do you have sufficient clarity to be able to make the innovations, to make the corrections? This is what exile is all about. It's very interesting. What is the responsibility of a parent for a child? I can tell you, I was raised at a time, most people didn't have very much. In the 50s, most people did not have very much. But yet, I never ever knew that my parents didn't have that much. They never, anything we needed, we had, despite the fact it was a struggle to provide that little bit that we had. And we never felt we were lacking. So the ingenious level of a parent is to make a child feel secure and confident and not to worry what tomorrow will bring. You have nothing to worry about. You just do your thing, you go to school, your meals are in place, the warmth, there's heat in the house, there's electricity, you have a little bit of spending money, although it wasn't very much, it's okay. And they would send you maybe to camp for 2-3 weeks in the summer, and that was good enough. And they bought you this pinky ball that you went down, you played handball in the park with. That it cost 5 cents, that ball, that was good. And you were satisfied, nothing more than that. That's the genius. So, because for a child to develop normally, a child cannot be distracted and have worries, and he has to be, in his emotion, has to be tranquil to be able to develop normally. I always say that the most important part of being a responsible Jew is normalcy. You have to be normal. If you're normal, you can make rational, responsible decisions. A person has an abnormality in his personality or in his emotion, all of your evaluation mechanism is off. And you can't really, you may go through certain motions, but you may do things extreme, which are not really appropriate. You really need a balance. For that balance, you need tremendous amount of an insular environment, protected from all the overwhelming negativity of society and the worries of society and the traumas of society. And that's really parents who are really, they get it, they don't allow their own worries to infiltrate into the children's lives. They protect the children. So the question is, how do we do it at a time where we don't have all these safeguards? We don't have the environment. We have the distractions. Now we read in the Tochacha, in the curses in the Torah, that every day will be worse than the previous day. And every day you say, when night would come, the problems were so intensified, they say, when will morning come? When morning comes, they see morning is worse than the previous night. It's going from bad to worse. So if that is what exile is about, going from bad to worse, what do? Madeleine Albright. She was a buddy of one of the people, Larry's buddy, Madeleine Albright, right? Secretary of State. Nobody knew she was a Jew. She concealed the fact that she was Jewish. There's a big secret. Why? Because her parents understood, misunderstood, that all the reasons why Jews are persecuted, because it's known they're Jewish. So what did her parents do? They buried it. It was a state secret. Nobody knew she was Jewish. And she lived like a Gentile. I'm not sure regarding her religion, what that was. But outward, nobody knew she was Jewish. You understand? So, of course, is the machinations of the evil inclination. Bury your Jewishness, flee from it, and whatever it may be. There was a case many years ago. There was a person who used to be part of Yad Avram. He was, Alan gets credit for bringing him. His name was Jeffrey Glick. And he was part of the group for many years. Moved down to Florida. And one day he comes and he says to me, he says, he was in Spain with his family, and they met a couple. And a young man, then he must have been maybe 21. His name was Chris. That was his first name. His father was a Bavarian, German, and he never knew he was a Jew. How did he find out he was a Jew? He was a Jew. He went to boarding school. He lived in Massachusetts. His father was a German, and he was married to his mother. He had no idea he was Jewish. And he went to boarding school in Massachusetts. And he came home one day all excited. He says, he says to his mother, he says, you know what I did today? We bloodied a Jew. We beat him up and we bloodied him. So the mother says to him, he's about 17 years old. He says, I want to tell you something. You're Jewish. When he heard that, he nearly passed out. Her parents were Holocaust survivors. And actually, because of that, she was raised as a Christian. She wore a crucifix, his mother, and it was a top secret. Her husband didn't know she was Jewish. He was a Bavarian, he was a German. But when it reached that level already, so that what happened? So eventually, he lived in New York, and he brought him to Yad Avram. The Christianity was so embedded in his soul. It came to midnight mass on the 25th. As much he knew he was Jewish, he had to go to midnight mass. It was so embedded in his soul. This whole feeling of being a Christian, although intellectually knew that wasn't his religion. And it was only due to whatever, it does make a difference. You understand what the evil inclination could do to a person because of fears and worries and sense of what? Of not having sufficient to survive, people go off the cliff. So despite that, with the religion, it's hard enough. With the education, it's hard enough. And what happens if you throw the religion overboard? Rabbi Wein has a history tape series. It was very popular about 30 years ago. And many people listened to it. This is when people still had tape decks in their car. And he had one thing on when the immigrants came from Lithuania and Russia between 1880 and 1910. There were 2.5 million immigrants who came, Jewish immigrants came from Europe because there were pogroms. It was a mass immigration to the United States. Many of the Jews in Europe were traditional. They put on tefillin every day. Not that they were really observant Jews, but traditionally they went through many motions. As the boat passed the Statue of Liberty, they took that tefillin, threw it over the side. That was the end of their religion because they understood that if they're going to get bogged down and with this identity, this Jewishness, everything else, it'll be an impediment for them to advance themselves. And he used to say the religion was a mile wide and an inch deep. That was the level of it, because it was so superficial. Therefore, the slightest level of worry would justify them abandoning what it was, because they felt that would be an impediment in their advancement, to be able to advance. Many years ago, there was a certain person, they were Yad Avram people, not going to mention names, they were married in way out in Long Island, in this person's house. She became observant, he was becoming observant. It was the second marriage, it was her first marriage. And it was in Dix Hills, Long Island. That's where the wedding took place. And I officiated at the wedding. So I took the Long Island Railroad out to Dix Hills, and it was in his home. He had a large home, he had a few acres of land, and it was in the garden. And I get there early to the wedding. A person approaches me, and he has a handlebar mustache, doesn't look Jewish. And he says to me, his last name is Redford. He says, you want to know? He says, when they were engaged, we made the engagement party for them. For the bride and the groom, we made the engagement party for him. And he says, my wife, she was the bride's best friend from Great Neck. Her name is Sue Cohn. And he says to me, I'm not Jewish. And he says, you want to know something? I know more about Judaism, about the Bible, than all the Jews here put together. Because I went to parochial school. And he's priding himself. So I said to him, I want to explain you something. Unfortunately, because the United States is a Christian society, you have no problem doing anything you want. And if studying the Bible doesn't ruffle anybody's feathers if you're a Christian, because but a Jew unfortunately believes if he wants to succeed in a Christian society, environment and society, He has to shed all his Jewish trappings. Therefore, he doesn't want to know anything about that because he feels being more Jewish will be an impediment for him to advance himself. So don't pride yourself. It's because you're a Christian. That's what it's all about. It's unfortunate, and that's the calamity why Jews are where they are, because they don't understand that it's not an impediment, but rather that will enhance their possibility to succeed. Just to the contrary. So recently, I was speaking to this woman, the bride's brother. I'm going 20 years afterwards. I said, and I shared with him the conversation. He said to me, they were divorced after 10 years. He was such an anti-Semite that even his wife couldn't deal with his anti-Semitism. That's what he was, okay? But what do Jews believe? And that's what the Jews are saying to Hashem. In exile, how do we survive it? We don't have all the support systems. We have all the problems. We have all the distractions. How do we survive this exile with all the restrictions, all the oppressions? So he says, and because of this, because of all these worries, whatever we believe, the evil inclination, he convinces us to remove ourselves from Judaism, from the yoke of Torah. You know, what was the Reform movement? The Reform movement believed that the cause of anti-Semitism was because we displayed our Judaism. And if we be more like the Gentile, there'll be less anti-Semitism. That was the basis for founding the Reform movement. So what happened? You know, there was a story, there was somebody many years ago, he was visiting from the Midwest, and he was raised as a Reformed Jew. His wife wasn't Jewish, his first wife, divorced. They even had a daughter from that woman. So he told me that when he went to the Reform temple, the rabbi asked the congregants, how many of you are of one parentage, Jewish parentage? Every member of the congregation raised their hand. He says, well, you don't have to worry. My mother wasn't Jewish either. You understand? That's what he said to the group. As they say in Yiddish, Ochenvei. Woe tell us that this is the reality of what's going on. So how did this happen? You know, we're progressive. Where are you progressing to? But that's exactly, because you have to, if you make an evaluation, rationally speaking, why do they hate us? Because we're different. And then you come up with all kinds of convoluted, baseless understandings. Well, dietary laws don't apply anymore because today we live in a more sophisticated society and trichinosis no longer applies. We have different kinds of pots. The metals are processed differently, and the china is no longer earthenware; it's glazed, and this and that. Therefore, all these issues are not issues any longer. And all this stuff was superstitious, and it was a different kind of society. And I had a case, a woman's rabbi told her, you don't have to circumcise your child anymore, because today, it was only for Jewish identity, but today where there's not that level of anti-Semitism, you don't have to circumcise your child. And this woman, her son was 17, he was not circumcised, because her rabbi told her, today it's not necessary to circumcise a child. This is the United States. So I'm saying, where's this? This is the blind leading the blind, and worse than that. Bla Kosev B'Loshen Tireh.